since my gardening space is limited to this little balcony that I have, I'm pretty ruthlessly pragmatic about what I choose to grow, and I only grow things that are edible and useful and that I enjoy eating. But just because I have this policy does not mean that I can't grow things that are also attractive. There are so many different kinds of plants you can get that are both edible and ornamental. There's all kinds of different beautiful kales and chard. There are different kinds of beans and peas that have beautiful blooms. And then there are also just edible forms of flowers. And one form of flower that I'm growing in the garden that's really been a good crop for me are these little violets that I have here. So some people call them violets, some people call them pansies, some people call them violas. Anything that goes by that name is edible, both the flowers and the greenery that it grows, although I've not eaten the leaves themselves. So these ones that I have are just called Johnny Jump Ups. In the area where I live, you just see them growing in the wild often, or on people's lawns as kind of a weed. But I have grown them from seed. And one really great thing about this particular kind of flower is that they are incredibly shade tolerant. They will tolerate, this area that I have here, they get maybe 1 or 2 hours of direct sun per night, and they are thriving. So you can eat these little violets just straight up. You can just pluck them from the garden and munch on them. They don't have that much of a taste. But what I like to do with them is prepare them in a couple of different ways. So one thing that I do is just harvest them and freeze the little flowers whole in cubes of ice, and then you can put it in lemonade or iced tea and it makes a really pretty ice cube. That's pretty straightforward. But another thing that's really, really nice to do is to candy them. And what I'm going to do is show you how I do that process and some different applications that you can use for them once you've preserved them in this way. So when you're growing pansies, if you want to preserve the life of them and make them continue to bloom, one thing that you should pay attention to is just sort of the bloom cycle that they go through. After the flowers that have been open like this, they'll close up and they'll start to go to seed, and once the plant starts going to seed, the entire sort of thing will shut down for the year and come back again next year. They are a perennial, but if you want them to continue their life cycle this particular year, you can just keep deadheading them by taking off the blossoms. So what I do, since I'm intending to keep growing them so that I can eat them, is every week I come through and I just cut off all the blooms that are currently showing. And when I'm doing the candied violets, I do this about 10 at a time. So I'm just going to cut off about 10 of them, and I cut them off all the way down to the base where they attach here, so I'll cut them off like this. So I cut off about 10 at a time, and then I'll show you that from there. So to make candied violets, you need just a few simple things, and the first, of course, is the violets themselves. And as I mentioned, I harvest about 10 at a time, and the reason for this is just that once you cut them off the plant, they tend to go a little bit limp kind of quickly. So if you keep it to just doing a few at a time, and then when you're done these, you go cut some more, that will prevent them from getting so limp that they become really difficult to work with. And then I have some very fine sugar, and I didn't have any, I couldn't find in the store, I didn't have any on hand, any super fine sugar. So what I did was just take regular conventional white granulated sugar and put it in a blender and just pulse it for about 10 seconds and it will become very fine. And then I have 1 egg white. And it's recommended that to the egg white you add a little bit of water. So I also have a tiny bit of water here. Sometimes I don't add this. I don't find it makes a tremendous difference, but I'm just going to add, this is 1 teaspoon. I'm probably going to add maybe like a half of that. Seems good. It's not really particular, but just put it in there and whip it around. And then I also have a paintbrush, and you need basically a paintbrush or something that you can paint the stuff onto the flower with. So I'm just going to mix the egg white around with that, and the whole process is essentially this. So you take one of your flowers, you can leave the stem on at this point, and then you go over each of the petals and you give it a decent coat of the egg white. So I do the front first, and then I flip it around and touch it onto my finger, and make sure you wash your hands first. And then I paint the back, and I also kind of paint, I don't know what this part is called, but the little part that attaches the petals to the stem. So when you've got your egg white painted on, front and back, and if you leave it too long once it's been cut, or if you're filming and it's taking a while like I've been doing, it'll start to kind of close in on itself. I don't know if that's visible, but basically the leaves are kind of pulling forward. They'll do that when they have been cut too long and it makes them more difficult to work with. So try and be quick if you can. But once that's done, I just take it and dip it in my little thing of sugar I have here. And if you have a spoon also, this really helps. So I just dip the front in and kind of swish it around. And then on the back side, I kind of just dump it like that a few times until it looks well coated. And then I hit it with the spoon like that to knock the excess off. And then you can have a look if the front, there looks like there's a few places here that are not super well covered, so I'll just do one more little dump there. You don't have to be too delicate. Even though these are little flowers, they're fairly resilient if you do this quickly after you first pick them. So that's what it will look like once you put the sugar on, and then you're just going to set it aside. So after you've got your batch of violets all painted and covered in sugar, and your hands are covered in egg whites and sugar, and everything is covered in egg whites and sugar, what you do then, if you've left the little tails here like I have, is you just cut the stem as close to the blossom as you can without cutting the part that's holding the flower petals together. So I'm not going to do it here because it will, if I cut this, it's going to drop sugar all over my computer. But just, there's this little cluster on the back of the flower petals that holds all the petals together, and then there's the stem, so I just cut the stem part where it's just the stick, and then I leave it on the little plate. You can also, if you have a drying rack, it makes it easier, less of the surface of the flower is going to be touching something, so it'll dry faster. But it's not necessary, it's just a little bit easier. So I just go along after I've painted them all and dipped them all in sugar and cut all these little tails off, and then essentially you're just leaving them to dry for 24 to 48 hours. What I do is leave them 24 hours usually on the back first. So how I have this one oriented, I kind of tip them all on their back like this. And then for the next 24 hours, I flip them on the other side and give that side a chance to dry better. So once you leave them to dry for about 48 hours, 24 hours on each side, you can go ahead and put them in an airtight container, and they'll last in here for up to about 3 months. So this is a batch that I made a few days ago, so these ones are nice and dry at this point. They look essentially the same as they did when I showed you the one that I'm in the process of making. They're just a little bit crispier. So I find them really nice to use as a decoration on soft baked goods, especially something that's light colored where you can really see them stand out. So on like a cake with a vanilla frosting, or I've used them a few times to make strawberry shortcakes for friends, and everybody has really loved it because not only do they look really cute, but also it's a nice crunchy texture in contrast to like the soft biscuit and strawberry and cream. They do have a slight violet-y taste, but it's not anything that's very overpowering. It's mostly just for how they look and the texture that they provide that they're here. So that's about all there is to it. I find them really charming and really nice to brighten up some sort of plain things that I'm making, but they are a little bit time consuming and messy to make. There are other methods you can use to make them. You can dip them in some simple syrup, but I have not tried that, so I can't vouch for how it works. I find this method works really well, and it's a really nice way to make something really special out of something that I'm growing in my garden.